Ethan Cole was 3 minutes late, holding a clipboard full of supply codes, when the floor beneath him lit up in a ring of pale blue light. He barely had time to blink before the loading dock vanished, replaced by a chamber built for giants. Stone pillars stretched upward into shadow. Cold air smelled faintly of ash and something older, something alive. He was not supposed to be here. He knew that before he even looked around. The transport request in his hand had said Cargo Bay 9, routine parts delivery. Nothing about this. Nothing about a hall the size of an aircraft hangar or the rows of armored women standing in formation along its edges, every one of them turning their head toward him at once. And nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the dragons. There were 5 of them, resting along a raised stone platform at the far end of the hall, wings folded, scales catching the low light in shades of copper and deep green. The moment Ethan appeared, all 5 lifted their heads. Then, one by one, they stood around him. The soldiers reacted instantly. Hands moved to weapons. A sharp voice barked something in a language Ethan didn't understand, and the ranks shifted, closing around him in a tight, controlled circle. He raised both hands slowly, clipboard still gripped in his fingers, heart hammering against his ribs. "There's been a mistake," he said, keeping his voice level. "I'm supply. I'm not supposed to be here." Nobody lowered their weapon. The dragons kept walking. They moved without hurry, the way something moves when it has already decided the outcome. Their claws struck the stone floor in slow, deliberate rhythm, and the soldiers around Ethan tensed further with every step, several of them shouting warnings toward the platform. None of it slowed the dragons down. Ethan had spent 6 years in uniform without firing a weapon in anger. He had spent his whole life being the man nobody noticed first. Now every eye in the room, human and otherwise, was fixed on him, and he had no idea why. The nearest dragon stopped less than 10 feet away. Up close, it was larger than anything Ethan had ever stood beside, its shoulder alone taller than he was. Its eyes were a deep, molten gold, and they were locked on his with an intensity that felt less like a predator sizing a prey and more like recognition. The chamber had gone almost silent. Even the soldiers who had been shouting orders a moment earlier now stood frozen, watching. Slowly, the dragon lowered its head, not to strike, not to threaten. It stopped an arm's length from his chest and simply stayed there, motionless, its breath warm and steady against the cold air of the hall. Ethan realized distantly that he had stopped breathing himself. A woman's voice cut through the silence, sharp and disbelieving, speaking words he didn't understand but could read clearly enough in her tone. Whatever she said, it wasn't a command. It was closer to a question nobody in the room could answer. The circle of soldiers around him hadn't relaxed. If anything, they looked more unsettled now than when he'd first appeared, weapons still raised, eyes darting between Ethan and the dragon in front of him as if waiting for something to explain itself. Ethan lowered his hands an inch, moving carefully, the clipboard nearly slipping from his fingers. "Easy," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the dragon, the soldiers, or himself. The dragon's eyes never left his face, and behind it, the other for it had begun to move as well, wings shifting, heads turning toward him one after another, the same unmistakable wave of attention settling over the room like a held breath. Whatever this place was, whatever unit these women belonged to, whatever the dragons had just decided about him standing in the middle of their sacred hall, Ethan understood, with a certainty that settled cold and clear in his chest, that the transport error which brought him here was not going to be quietly corrected. Someone was going to have to explain why the dragons had never done this before. And somehow, he had a feeling that someone was about to be him. The woman who had spoken first pushed through the ring of soldiers, and the others parted for her without being told. She wore the same dark combat plating as the rest, but hers carried markings the others didn't, etched along the shoulder in a pattern that looked almost like scales. Her eyes swept over Ethan once, quick in assessing, before locking on the dragon still standing in front of him. She said something low and urgent. The dragon didn't move. Ethan had spent enough years around command structures to recognize authority when he saw it, even in a language he couldn't understand. This woman was in charge. And right now, she looked less angry than genuinely thrown, the kind of expression Ethan associated with people watching something break a rule they didn't know could be broken. "I need someone who speaks English," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm. Or, I need to go back where I came from. Either one. A younger soldier near the edge of the circle glanced at him, hesitated, then stepped forward. I speak English, she said carefully. You are not supposed to be in this hall. I know that, Ethan said. Trust me. I know that better than anyone here. This is the bonding sanctum, she continued, watching the dragons as she spoke. No one enters without invitation. Not soldiers. Not officers. No one. So, how did I get here? She didn't answer right away, because a commander had turned toward them, snapping out a question of her own. The soldier translated it without hesitation. She wants to know your transport authorization code. Ethan held up the clipboard, hand still slightly unsteady. Cargo transfer. Bay 9. I don't know how I ended up in a sacred dragon hall instead of a supply dock, but I promise you, nobody wanted this less than me. The translation drew a longer silence than he expected. The commander studied him for a moment, then turned and said something sharp toward the platform, gesturing for the dragons to withdraw. Four of them did. The fifth stayed exactly where it was. The commander's jaw tightened. She repeated the order, harder this time, and the dragon lowered its head slightly, not in submission, but in something closer to refusal. A ripple of unease moved through the soldiers around the hall. Whatever this dragon was doing, it clearly wasn't in anyone's playbook. She says the dragons do not move toward mistakes, the young soldier said quietly, translating almost before the commander finished speaking. She says this has never happened before. That makes two of us, Ethan muttered. The commander approached, stopping close enough that Ethan could see the fatigue behind her sharp expression, the look of someone who had been fighting a long war long before he ever stumbled into her hall. She studied him for several seconds, then spoke directly to him, her tone flat and controlled even through the language barrier. She wants to know if you have ever bonded with a dragon before, the translator said, or been near one, anywhere, ever. No, Ethan said honestly, never seen one until about 10 minutes ago. The commander's eyes narrowed slightly at the translation, and she glanced back at the dragon still standing beside him, its golden eyes half-lidded but never straying from Ethan's face. Something about her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but sharpening into a different kind of focus. She gave a short order. Two soldiers moved toward Ethan, not to restrain him, but to escort him toward a side chamber, weapons finally lowering as they walked. The dragon fell into step behind them, unhurried, its massive frame filling the corridor with quiet, deliberate presence. What happens now? Ethan asked the translator, who walked close beside him. Command will want you removed immediately, she said. Sent back through transport, memory logged, incident closed. That is protocol. But... She hesitated, glancing back at the dragon, following them. But the dragons do not forget when someone is denied to them. If they send you away now, and the dragon remembers, it may never trust anyone brought before it again. Not soldier, not officer, no one. Ethan absorbed that in silence, the weight of it settling slowly. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't asked to stand in a hall built for creatures older than written history, or to have one of them decide, for reasons no one could explain, that he belonged there. But as they reached the side chamber and the massive doors closed behind them, sealing him inside with a commander who clearly didn't want him there, and a dragon that clearly refused to leave, Ethan understood one thing with complete certainty. Whatever happened next, they weren't sending him home. Not yet. The side chamber was smaller than the sanctum, its walls lined with old carvings Ethan couldn't read. The air warmer, quieter, heavy with something that felt almost like hell breath. The commander stood near a narrow table, arms crossed, watching him with the same unreadable focus she'd worn since the hall. The dragon settled onto the stone floor nearby, wings folding slowly, its golden eyes never leaving Ethan for more than a few seconds at a time. She has decided not to send you back through transport yet, the translator said, standing just inside the door. Her name, Ethan had learned on the walk over, was Sarah. Not until she understands why Caliph responded to you. Caliph, Ethan repeated. That's her name? His, Sarah corrected. He is the eldest of the bonded here. Older than anyone in this unit. Older than the war we are fighting. Ethan looked at the dragon again, at the deep grooves along its scales that might have been age or might have been old wounds, and felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't quite name. Caliph held his gaze steadily, patient in a way that felt less like an animal and more like someone waiting for a conversation to begin. The commander said something low, and Sarah translated without hesitation. She is asking permission. From Caliph, not from you. Permission for what? Before Sarah could answer, the dragon moved. It didn't lunge, didn't threaten. It simply lowered its head until its eyes were level with Ethan's, close enough that he could see his own reflection in the gold. And then something happened that Ethan had no framework for at all. A memory rose behind his eyes that wasn't his own, sudden and vivid, pulling him somewhere else entirely. He saw a research outpost, decades old by the look of the equipment. He saw a man in a uniform Ethan almost recognized, the shape of an old shoulder patch, kneeling in the dirt beside an injured creature no larger than a horse, scales the same deep gold as Calip's eyes. The man was talking softly, steady, unafraid, one hand resting gently against the creature's flank while explosions lit the skies somewhere in the distance. The image held for only a few seconds before fading, leaving Ethan gripping the edge of the stone table, breathing hard. "What was that?" he said, voice rougher than he intended. Sarah was staring at him now with an expression that had nothing to do with suspicion. "You saw something. A man with a dragon. Decades ago, it looked like." Ethan pressed a hand to his forehead, the image still burning behind his eyes. "I don't understand what that has to do with me." The commander stepped closer, studying his face with new intensity, and asked something quiet through Sarah. She wants to know the man's name, if you recognize him. Ethan hadn't thought about it in years, but the shape of that shoulder, the set of that jaw, tugged at something buried deep in old family stories he'd never taken seriously. "My great-grandfather served overseas in something classified. Nobody in my family ever knew details. He never talked about it before he died." He looked up. "You're telling me that memory came from him?" "Not from him," Sarah said slowly, translating as the commander spoke. "From Caliph. He remembers the ones who were kind to his kind, even for a moment, even generations ago. That memory does not simply appear for anyone. It appears for blood." The chamber fell quiet, except for the low sound of Calip's breathing. Ethan stared at the dragon, at the ancient gold eyes that had just shown him a piece of his own family no living person had ever spoken of, and felt the fear that had gripped him since the transport era began to loosen into something else entirely. Something closer to disbelief. Something closer to wonder. Caliph lowered his head the rest of the way, until his snout nearly touched the stone floor in front of Ethan's feet. It wasn't submission. Sarah's voice, when she spoke again, had lost its careful neutrality entirely. "He's not testing you anymore," she said quietly. "That is a bow. I have never seen him do that. Not once. Not for anyone in this unit. Not for command. Not for anyone." The commander said nothing for a long moment, studying the scene in front of her with the stunned expression of someone watching a rule she trusted her whole career quietly rewrite itself. Whatever she had planned to do with Ethan, whatever protocol demanded, it was clear from her face that none of it accounted for this. Outside the chamber, faint and growing louder, came the sound of raised voices, several of them, moving fast down the corridor toward them. Word had already started to spread through the outpost, and judging by the sharp edge in those approaching voices, not everyone was going to be as willing as Caliph to accept a mistake standing in their sacred hall. The chamber doors opened before the commander could respond, and 3 officers strode in, their uniforms marked with insignia Ethan hadn't seen yet, sharper and more severe than anything worn by the soldiers in the hall. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with cold eyes, took one look at Ethan and then at Caliph, settled calmly on the floor, and his expression darkened. He spoke rapidly, his tone leaving no doubt about his opinion. Sarah translated in a low voice, staying close to Ethan's side. "He says a human should never have been allowed inside the sanctum. He is demanding immediate removal and a full incident report." The commander answered without flinching, her voice even but firm, and gestured toward Caliph. Whatever she said made the officer's jaw tighten further. He turned to look at the dragon directly, as if daring it to move, but Caliph only watched him with the same unhurried patience he'd shown since the hall. "He doesn't believe the bond is real," Sarah murmured. "He thinks it's coincidence. Or manipulation." "Manipulation by who?" Ethan asked. "I didn't ask to be here." Sarah didn't answer that, because the officer had already turned and stormed back out, his two subordinates following close behind, throwing one last hard look at Ethan over their shoulders. The commander exhaled slowly once the doors closed again, some of the tension leaving her shoulders, though not all of it. "That was Commander Threll," Sarah said. "He oversees logistics coordination for the sector. He and our commander do not agree on many things. This will not be the last you hear from him." Ethan filed the name away, some old instinct from years of paperwork and cargo manifests quietly pricking at the back of his mind. Logistics coordination. He knew exactly what that meant, because it had been his job on Earth for 6 years, buried in numbers most people never bothered to check. "Can I see the supply reports for this outpost?" he asked. Sarah blinked, clearly not expecting that question, and translated it to the commander with visible hesitation. The commander studied Ethan for a long moment, then gave a short nod, gesturing toward a data terminal built into the chamber wall. "She says you may look," Sarah said. "She wants to know why. Because if I'm going to be stuck here while everyone decides what to do with me, I might as well be useful." Ethan moved to the terminal, and after a moment of fumbling with unfamiliar symbols, Sarah guided his hands through the interface until the screen filled with columns of numbers that looked, mercifully, close enough to formats he understood. He scanned through shipment logs, timestamps, unit allocations. Years of habit kicked in almost immediately, his eyes catching on small inconsistencies most people would scroll past without noticing. A supply run marked complete that never matched its manifest weight. A maintenance shipment routed through 2 extra waypoints for no log reason. Numbers that technically balance, but never quite lined up the way they should. "This doesn't add up," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Sarah leaned closer, studying the screen. "What doesn't add up?" "These 3 shipments. They're marked as full deliveries, but the weight logs are inconsistent with what actually left the depot. Someone skimming inventory, or rerouting it somewhere off the books." He pulled up another set of records, cross-referencing dates. "And look at this. Every discrepancy traces back to sign-offs from the same clearance level." The commander, watching over Sarah's translation, went very still. "Whose clearance level?" she asked through Sarah, though something in her tone suggested she already feared the answer. Ethan pulled up the authorization trail, following it back through layers of digital signatures until it settled on a single name repeated across every flagged shipment. He didn't need Sarah to translate the look on the commander's face when she saw it. Before anyone could speak, the terminal screen flickered once, then went dark, the entire data log wiped clean in the span of a single second. Ethan stared at the blank screen, then at Caliph, who had risen suddenly to his feet, wings half spread, head turned sharply toward the chamber door as if he'd heard something no one else had. "Someone just erased that," Ethan said slowly, "in real time." Sarah's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, "which means they were watching us. Right now, which means they knew you found it." The commander was already moving, snapping orders toward the door, her earlier caution replaced entirely by urgency. Whatever quiet political dispute had been simmering in this outpost before Ethan arrived, it had just stopped being quiet. And judging by the tightness in her voice and the way Kalida's low growl rumbled to the chamber floor, it was about to stop being safe. Alarms tore through the outpost less than 10 minutes later, a rising wail that sent soldiers sprinting past the chamber doors, shouting orders in overlapping voices. The commander pushed to the corridor with Ethan and Sarah close behind, Caleb moving at their side with a speed that made the walls seem to shrink around him. "Report." The commander snapped, and a young officer skidded to a stop in front of her, breathless. Sarah translated fast, barely keeping pace. Perimeter sensors just went dark on the eastern ridge. No warning, no distress signal. Whoever did it knew exactly which systems to hit first. The same systems tied to the wiped shipment logs, Ethan said, already piecing it together. Threll's clearance. The commander's expression hardened into something colder than anger. She barked another order, and soldiers began moving in tight, practice formations toward the outer defenses. But Ethan could see it in their faces, the same thing he felt tightening in his own chest. They were reacting, not ready. "How many dragons are bonded to this unit?" he asked Sarah as they moved. 12, including Caliph. 5 are here at the outpost. The others are stationed along the southern line, too far to reach in time. And the eastern ridge, that's the weakest point? Sarah hesitated only a second before nodding. "It always has been. We've requested reinforcement for months. It was denied every time. Now I understand why." They reached the outer wall as the first wave hit. Distant flashes lighting the horizon followed seconds later by the deep rolling boom of impact. Soldiers scrambled to defensive positions along the ridge, and Ethan felt every instinct in his body screaming to get back, to find cover, to let people trained for this handle it. But his eyes kept catching on the gaps, the same kind of gaps he used to find buried in supply manifests, except now they were holes in a defense line that someone had deliberately left open. "Your sensors on the north relay," he said suddenly, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Are they tied to the same network as the eastern ridge?" She blinked, startled, then relayed the question to a nearby technician, who answered fast and nervous. "Yes, same relay hub." "Then it's not down. It's rerouted." Ethan turned toward the commander, pointing toward a secondary terminal half buried under sandbags near the wall. If someone diverted power to hide the breach, the backup feed should still be running somewhere close by. Manual override, not digital, so it wouldn't show up on whatever they wiped. The commander studied him for half a second, then made a decision Ethan hadn't expected. She grabbed his shoulder and shoved him toward the terminal, barking a single sharp word that needed no translation. "Move." Ethan dropped to his knees beside the buried console, hands moving fast over unfamiliar controls. Sarah crouched beside him, translating labels as quickly as she could. Explosions lit the sky above them in bursts of white and orange, the ground trembling with each impact. And for a moment Ethan's hand shook badly enough that he nearly lost his grip on the panel. Kalitha's low growl rumbled beside him, steady and unbroken, and somehow that sound alone was enough to settle something in Ethan's chest. He forced his hand still and kept working. "There," he said, finding the override buried 3 menus deep. This should restore the direct feed. The screen flickered, then surged to life, and across the ridge, defense turrets that had gone dark snapped back online one by one, swinging toward the incoming wave with mechanical precision. Soldiers cheered from their positions as the tide of the attack staggered, the enemy's advantage as a prize collapsing in an instant. But the celebration didn't last. A second wave broke from the tree line, larger than the first, moving with a coordinated precision of force that had planned for exactly this outcome. And at the front of it, Ethan caught sight of familiar insignia through the smoke, the same clearance marking he'd traced through the wiped shipment logs less than an hour earlier. Threll hadn't just sabotaged the outpost defenses. He was leading the attack himself. The commander shouted new orders, soldiers scrambling to adjust. But Ethan could see the strain already cracking through their formation, exhausted from a fight they'd been forced into without warning. Caliph rose to his full height beside them, wings spreading wide against the firelit sky. And for the first time since Ethan had arrived, the old dragon's golden eyes weren't calm. They were furious. And as the second wave closed in, every dragon on the ridge turned in the same direction at once. Not toward their officers, not toward the commanders shouting orders behind them, but toward the one person in the entire outpost who had spent the last hour proving, without ever meaning to, that he belonged here more than anyone expected. Ethan felt it before he understood it. 5 pairs of eyes swinging toward him through the smoke and firelight, waiting. Caliph lowered his head slightly, angling his shoulder in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. He was asking, not the commander. Him. "They want direction," Sarah said, breathless, staring at the dragons with something close to disbelief. "They're waiting for you to move." "I'm not a soldier," Ethan said. "I don't know how to command a battle." "You already have been," she said. "Every decision since the sensors went down. They've been following your lead without either of you noticing. There wasn't time to argue with that." The second wave was closing fast, and Threll's forces had clearly studied the outpost's weaknesses long before tonight. driving hard toward the gap in the eastern line the sabotage had been designed to create. The commander was still shouting orders, but her formations were built around defenses that no longer existed the way they used to, and Ethan could see the confusion rippling through her soldiers as the plan they'd trained for came apart in real time. He looked at the terminal still glowing beside him, then at the ridge, then at Kalitha's waiting eyes, and something clicked into place with the same clarity he used to feel staring down a supply manifest that didn't balance. "They're pushing everything through the gap," he said, mostly to himself, then louder, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Tell the commander to pull the center line back, not forward. Let them commit to the gap." Sarah translated fast, and the commander's head snapped toward him, sharp and questioning, but something in her hesitation broke when Caliph let out a low sound and turned his body to face the exact direction Ethan had pointed. She didn't need more convincing than that. New orders tore through the ranks, soldiers falling back in the center in control retreat, and Threll's forces surged forward exactly as Ethan hoped, driving deeper into what looked like an opening. It was a trap closing on itself. The 5 dragons launched at once, Caliph leading them low over the retreating soldiers before rising sharply, wings catching the firelight as they arced toward the overextended enemy line. Ethan had never seen anything like it. 5 massive shapes moving with terrifying coordination, not wild, not chaotic, but disciplined in a way that spoke of centuries of partnership between dragon and soldier. Threll's forces broke formation almost immediately, caught between the closing ranks of soldiers and the sky full of fire above them. Ethan watched, heart pounding, as the neat, confident advance he'd seen to the smoke minutes earlier collapsed into scattered retreat. But Threll himself didn't run. Ethan saw him through a gap in the smoke, standing his ground near the collapsed sensor relay, shouting orders that no one around him was following anymore. And then Threll's eyes found him, locking across the battlefield with a hatred that needed no translation at all. Kayla saw it too. The old dragon broke from the formation in Dove, and Ethan's stomach dropped as he realized what was about to happen, but Caliph didn't strike. He landed hard between Threll and the retreating soldiers, wings flaring wide, a wall of scale and fury that made even Threll's hardened officers stumble backward. Threll shouted something furious, and Sarah, arriving breathless at Ethan's side, translated with a shaking voice. He says the dragons were never supposed to trust an outsider, that the entire plan depended on it. He says none of this should have been possible. "What plan?" Ethan said. Sarah listened to Threll's continued shouting, her face going pale. He says the sabotage was built around one assumption, that the dragons would never fully commit to defending this outpost without a bonded commander leading them from the front. He was certain no one could fill that role in time. He never accounted for her. She stopped looking at Ethan. "For me," Ethan finished quietly. The last of Threll's forces scattered into the tree line, and within minutes the outpost's remaining soldiers had secured the ridge, dragging equipment and wounded back toward safety. Threll himself was seized before he could retreat, his officers surrendering around him with the stunned expressions of men who had just watched their entire strategy dissolve because of one man nobody had planned for. Kayla turned from the captured commander and walked back toward Ethan, slow and steady despite the exhaustion clearly weighing on him after fight. He lowered his head one final time, resting it gently against Ethan's shoulder, a gesture that needed no translation either. Around them, soldiers who had spent the entire night treating Ethan as an unwelcome accident now stood watching in silence, several lowering their weapons fully for the first time since he'd arrived. The commander approached slowly, her expression unreadable, studying Ethan and Kayla together for a long moment before she finally spoke. Sarah's voice, when she translated, had lost every trace of its earlier caution. "She says the dragons were never wrong," Sarah said quietly. "She says it was everyone else who almost made the mistake." The morning after the battle, the sanctum looked different to Ethan than it had the day before. The same stone pillars stretched into shadow, the same cold air carried the scent of ash, but the silence that had once felt like a threat now felt like something closer to peace. Soldiers moved through the hall with quiet purpose, and none of them reached for a weapon when Ethan walked past. Caliph waited near the raised platform, the other 4 dragons resting close beside him, all 5 heads lifting when Ethan entered. This time, no one moved to stop him from approaching. The commander stood near the center of the hall, and beside her, Sarah, who had barely left Ethan's side since the fighting ended. Word of the battle had already reached command channels far beyond the outpost. Carried with it the story of a human logistics specialist who uncovered a sabotage plot no one else had caught, then stood beside 5 war dragons to defend a line that should never have held. She has received orders from the Alliance Council, Sarah said, watching Ethan's face carefully as she translated. They want to remove you. Standard protocol for an unauthorized transport into a bonded outpost. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, glancing toward Caliph, who watched the exchange with quiet, unreadable patience. But the commander refused, Sarah continued, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. She told the council that removing you now would break something in this unit that took centuries to build. She told them Caliph bonded to you the moment you walked into this hall, and no order from a council desk was going to undo that. The commander said something further, direct and steady, and this time she looked at Ethan while she spoke, not waiting for the translation to finish before giving a small, respectful nod in his direction. She's asking if you want to stay, Sarah said. Not as an accident, not as an incident report, as one of us. Ethan looked around the hall, at the soldiers who no longer flinched at his presence, at Sarah who had gone from cautious translator to something closer to a friend, at the commander who had risked her career defending a mistake that never behaved like one. And he looked at Caliph, ancient and patient, who had seen something in him before Ethan had even understood it himself. He thought of his great-grandfather, kneeling beside an injured dragon decades ago in a story no one in his family had ever fully told, and felt the strange, quiet symmetry of standing in this hall now, carrying forward a bond he never knew existed until a transport error placed him directly in its path. Yes, Ethan said simply. I want to stay. Sarah translated, and the reaction rippled to the hall immediately. Soldiers straightening, several exchanging small, relieved smiles. The commander stepped forward and placed a hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder, a gesture Sarah didn't need to translate at all. Caliph rose to his full height and let out a low sound that echoed to the sanctum, deep and resonant, and the other 4 dragons answered in kind, their voices blending into something that felt less like noise and more like celebration. Soldiers around the hall began striking their weapons against their shields in rhythm, a sound Sarah later explained was reserved only for formal bonding ceremonies, a sound this unit hadn't used in longer than anyone could remember. In the days that followed, Ethan learned the shape of his new life slowly, training beside soldiers who had once demanded his removal and now treated him like family, learning the discipline of a partnership between human and dragon that had existed for centuries before he ever stumbled into it. Caliph remained close, patient as ever, teaching him without a single word that trust, once earned honestly, rarely needed explaining twice. Threll's capture ended the immediate threat to the outpost, but Ethan understood, standing in the sanctum weeks later watching new recruits arrive with the same nervous uncertainty he once carried, that this was only the beginning of something much larger. The alliance between humans and dragons had been fragile before, tested by doubt and old suspicion. Now, for the first time in generations, it had proved standing in its own hall that the bond could stretch further than anyone believed. Ethan Cole had arrived at this outpost by mistake, sent to the wrong place at the wrong time, expected to be corrected and forgotten within the hour. Instead, he stayed, and as Kayla settled beside him in the quiet warmth of the sanctum, golden eyes closing in easy, contented rest, Ethan understood that some mistakes were never mistakes at all. Some were simply the universe finding the right person in the wrong room at exactly the right time.